What and how many and manifold have been the exorbitant exactions as the fruits and foments of this cruel tyranny, that the godly in our land have been groaning under these 27 years, and upon what occasions they have been, at diverse times, and in diverse manners and measures imposed, I need not here relate. The first part of the treatise doth represent it. The first of these tyrannical exactions were the fines for not hearing the curates and other parts of nonconformity, which, together with paying the curates' stipends, were too universally at first complied with, but afterwards, upon more mature consideration, and after clearer discoveries of the imposer's projects and practices, they were scrupled and refused by the more tender. And their sufferings upon the account of that recusancy have been very great and grievous, to the utter impoverishment and depopulation of many families, besides the personal sufferings of many in long imprisonments, which some choose rather to sustain with patience than to pay the least of those exactions. Yea, some, when ordered to be legally liberate, and set forth out of prison, choose rather to be detained still in bondage than to pay the jailer's fees their keepers demanded of them. Many other wicked impositions have been pressed and prosecuted with great rigor and rage, as militia money and locality for furnishing soldiers, lifted under a banner displayed against religion and liberty, with necessary provision in and for their wicked service, which of late years have been contended against by the sufferings of many, and daily growing a trial to more. But the most impudently insolent of all these impositions, and that which plainly paraphrases, openly expresses, and explains all the rest, calculate for the same ends, was by that wicked act of convention enacted in the year 1678, declaring very plainly its ends, to levy and maintain forces for suppressing meetings, and to show unanimous affection for maintaining the king's supremacy established by law, or, as they represent it in their act for continuation of it, Act 4, Parliament 3, Char 2nd, August 20th, 1681, quote, seeing the Convention of Estates held at Edinburgh in the month of July, 1678, upon weighty considerations therein specified, and particularly the great danger the kingdom was under by seditious and rebellious conventicles, and the necessity which then appeared to increase the forces for securing the government and suppressing these rebellious commotions, which were fomented by seditious principles and practices, did therefore humbly and dutifully offer a cheerful and unanimous supply of 800,000 pounds Scots at the space of 5 years. And the Estates of Parliament now convening have taken into consideration how the dangers from the foresaid causes do much increase, insofar as are seditiously and rebelliously inclined, do still propagate their pernicious principles, and go on from one degree of rebellion to another, till now at the last the horrid villainies of murder, assassination, and avowed rebellion are owned, not only as things lawful, but as obligations from their religion, do therefore in a due sense of their duty to God, to their sacred sovereign, and the preservation of themselves and their posterity, of new make and humble, unanimous, cheerful, and hearty offer for themselves, and in name of, and as representing this his Majesty's ancient kingdom, of a continuation of the foresaid supply, granted by the Convention or Estates, and that for the space of 5 years, or 10 terms successive, beginning the first term's payment at Martinmas 1684, which yet is to be continued until Martinmas 1688, unquote. Here is a sample of their wicked demands, showing the nature, quality, and tendency of all of them, wherein we may note, first, that they continue it was upon the same considerations upon which it was first granted. Secondly, that these were, and yet remain to be, the danger of the meetings of the Lord's people for gospel ordinances by them forced into the fields, which they call rebellious conventicles, and the necessity of securing their usurpation upon the prerogatives of Christ, liberties of his church, and privileges of mankind, which they call their government, and suppressing the testimonies for the interest of Christ, called by them rebellious commotions. Thirdly, that their motive of continuing it was their considerations of some weak remainders of former zeal for God, in prosecuting the testimony for the interests of Christ, and principles of the covenanted Reformation, which they call propagating pernicious principles, and some weak attempts to oppose and resist their rebellion against God, and vindicate the work and defend the people of God from the destruction they intended against them, and their lawful and obliged endeavors to bring these destroyers and murderers to condign punishment, which they call horrid villainies of murder, assassinations, and avowed rebellion. Here all the active appearances of the Lord's people, vindicated in the foregoing heads, are industriously represented under these odious and invidious names, as motives to contribute this supply of means to suppress them, and to involve all the contributors in the guilt of condemning them. Fifthly, that is a test of their allegiance, fourthly, that is a test of their allegiance unto and confederacy with that execrable tyrant, which they call their duty to their sacred sovereign. They enact this as representatives of the kingdom, and must be owned as such by all the payers. Fifthly, that it is the same cess that was granted by the Convention of Estates, and the term of its continuation is not yet expired. And hence it is manifest that the Act of Convention, though its first date be expired, and thereupon many plead for the for the lawfulness of paying it now that formerly scrupled at and witnessed against it, yet is only renewed, revived, and corroborated, and the exaction continued upon no other basis or bottom but the first state constitution, which was and remains to be a consummating and crimson wickedness, the cry whereof reaches heaven. Since upon the matter it was the setting of a day betwixt and which, exceeding the Gadarenes' wickedness, and short of their civility, they did not beseech Christ and his gospel to be gone out of Scotland, but with armed violence declared, they would with the strong hand drive him out of his possession, in order to which their legions are levied, with a professed declaration that having exauctorate the Lord's anointed by law, and clothed the usurper with the spoils of his honor, they will by force maintain what they have done, and having taken to themselves the house of God in possession, they will sacrifice the lives, liberties, and fortunes of all in the nation, to secure themselves in the peaceable possession of what they have robbed God, and that there shall not be a soul left in the nation who shall not be slain, shut up, or sold as slaves, who will own Christ and his interest, all which they could not nor cannot accomplish without the subsidiary contribution of the people's help. This is the plain sense of the act for the cess, and though not expressed, the tacit and uniform intention of all the rest. Yet, for as monstrous and manifest the wickedness of these designs are, so judicially were the bulk of our seers plagued with blindness, that many of them were left to plead for the payment of these impositions. Others, though they durst not for a world do it themselves, to be silent, and by their silence to encourage and embolden many to such a compliance, presuming with themselves, and without further enquiry, that the zeal of God and love to his glory, and the souls of their brethren, would constrain them to speak in so clement a case, if they did not observe any sin in it, whereby the universality was involved in the guilt of these things, especially deceived by the patrociny and pleadings of such of late who formerly witnessed against it. Oh, that it might be given to us to remember Lot's wife, turned into a pillar of salt, to season us, lest the stink of our destruction, and what may follow upon it, be all that the posterity get for a warning not to tread our paths. As for the few that have suffered upon this head, they have been so discruciated with perplexities in their conflicts with the rage of enemies, and reproach of friends, and fear of these snares attending every lot of occupation they could put themselves in, that they have been made to desire death as their best refuge, and only retreat wherein they may find rest from all these rackings. For in no place could they escape the reach of some of these impositions, nor the noise of their clamorous contendings of arguments that pleaded for it. But some have had more love to Christ and his interests than language to plead for him, and more resolution to suffer than learning to dispute for his cause, and where pure zeal for Christ and love to his bleeding interests in a time when he is crucified afresh and put to open shame, and the concurrence of all is required to help forward the war against him, is in integrity and vigor, it will burn with its flame those knots that cannot in haste loose, and choose rather to lie under the imputation of being zealous without knowledge, than loose or let go such an opportunity of witnessing a good confession, yea, when it could do more, expire with an Ichabod in its mouth. But shortly, to come to this point, I shall, 1, permit some concessions, 2, propose some parallel questions, and 3, offer some reasons to clear it. 1. I shall willingly grant in the general concerning paying of exactions, impositions, or emoluments. Firstly, they are to be paid to these to whom they are due, as tribute and custom is to be paid to the powers ordained of God, and for this cause they that are God's ministers attending continually upon this very thing. Romans 13, verses 6 and 7. So stipends and all outward encouragements are due to the ministers of the gospel, who sow spiritual things and should reap these carnal things. 1 Corinthians 9, verses 11 and 12. Fines also and all legal amercements for delinquencies against such laws must be paid. Deuteronomy 22, verse 19. And whatsoever is due by law to officers appointed by law for keeping delinquents in custody, as all debts whatsoever. But tyrants' exactions, enacted and exacted for promoving their wicked designs against religion and liberty, hirelings' salaries for encouraging them in their intrusions upon the church of God, arbitrary impositions of pecuniary punishments for clear duties, and extorted hirings of the subordinate instruments of persecutors' oppressions are no ways due, and cannot be debt, and therefore no equity to pay them. Secondly, it is lawful to pay them when due and debt, either by law or contract, even though they should be afterwards abused and misproven to pernicious ends. But these payments for such wicked ends, either particularly specified and expressed in the very act appointing them, or openly avouched by the exactors, are of another nature than impositions fundamentally appointed for the public good, and the after misapplication thereof made by such as are entrusted therewith is no more imputable unto the land or payers than is the theft of a collector stealing or running away with the same without making count or reckoning to superiors. It is then a foolish thing to say that former impositions were peaceably paid, though we saw and were convinced that their use was perverted, and they were used against the good of the land of God's people. For no such thing was laid down as the ground, or declared as the end of these exactions. But what fell out was by the personal abuse and perversion of those in power, which was their own personal fault, and posterior to the legal engagement and submission to the payment thereof by the land and their representatives. Thirdly, it is lawful to pay them sometimes, even when fundamentally and originally from the first constitution of them they were not due, but illegally or usurpatively challenged and exacted, if afterwards they were by dedition or voluntary engagement legally submitted unto by the true representatives. But not so when they were never either lawfully enacted, or legally enacted, or voluntarily engaged by the representatives, except such as represented the enslavement of the nation, and betrayed the country, religion, liberty, property, and all precious interests, and declaredly imposed to further the destruction of all. Nor can any with reason say that this case is but like the case of the people of Israel, under the feet of enemies, paying to them of the fruits of their ground, as was regretted and lamented by Nehemiah in Nehemiah chapter 9, verse 36 and 37. For so they must say, the exactions now in debate are their redemption money, and by these they purchase their liberty of life and lands, and own themselves to be a people under conquest. And yet they cannot deny, but they are both exacted and paid as tests of their allegiance as subjects and badges of their loyalty and obedience. But this is answered before in Head 2.